You open your mouth and make a sound. The sound means nothing by itself, but the person next to you understands exactly what you mean. They answer. You understand them back. You do this thousands of times every single day without thinking about it. But stop for a moment and consider what is actually happening. You are producing a sequence of vibrations in the air by expelling air from your lungs through your throat, past a small flap of tissue called the vocal folds, and shaping that air with your tongue, lips, and jaw. Those vibrations travel through the air at about 340 meters per second. They enter another person's ear, vibrate their eardrum, get translated into electrical signals in their cochlea, and those signals travel to their brain, where they are decoded into meaning, with such speed and precision that the entire process happens in less time than it takes you to read this sentence. No other animal does anything remotely as complex. And the question is, how did this start? When did our ancestors first begin to speak? Why did they make the evolutionary investment to develop a communication system that requires a fundamentally restructured brain, a redesigned throat, and years of childhood learning to master, when every other species on Earth gets by just fine with grunts and gestures? Here is the paradox. Language is one of the most complex cognitive abilities that any species has ever developed. Yet every human child acquires it effortlessly without formal instruction, simply by being exposed to it. A 3-year-old who cannot tie their shoes can produce and understand sentences they have never heard before. They can grasp grammatical rules, infer meaning from context, and use language to manipulate the behavior of others. This ability is universal across all cultures. There never have been, as far as archaeologists can tell. Language is not a cultural invention like writing or agriculture. It is a biological adaptation, as much a part of human biology as upright walking or opposable thumbs. So when did this adaptation emerge? What drove it? And why did our lineage go down this path? Well, no other primate did. The answer is more complex than you might expect. Language did not appear fully formed in a single moment of invention. It evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, shaped by the same forces that shape all biological traits. But unlike most biological traits, language left almost no direct fossil evidence. You cannot dig up a grammar. You cannot excavate a vocabulary. Linguists and archaeologists have had to reconstruct the evolution of language from indirect clues, the shape of fossil skulls, the anatomy of ancient throat cavities, the pattern of ancient DNA, the archaeological record of symbolic behavior, and the comparison of modern languages to infer their common ancestor. What they have found challenges many of our assumptions about what language is and when it emerged. The evidence suggests that language may be far older than most people realize. It may not have been a single invention. It may have evolved multiple times in different human species, and it may have changed the course of human evolution in ways we are only beginning to understand. To understand when language emerged, we first need to understand what language actually is, because it is not the same thing as speech. Speech is the physical act of producing sounds with your vocal apparatus. Language is the cognitive system that maps sounds to meaning, using a set of shared rules. This distinction matters because the two evolved on different timelines. The capacity for language, the cognitive ability to combine symbols according to rules to generate infinite meaning, may have emerged before the physical ability to produce the full range of speech sounds. Many researchers, including Michael Corballis, argued in his 2002 book From Hand to Mouth that the earliest human language was gestural, not spoken. Our ancestors communicated using hand signals, facial expressions, and body movements before their vocal anatomy evolved to support spoken language. The evidence for this theory comes from several sources. First, non-human primates communicate primarily through gesture, not vocalization. A chimpanzee can learn hundreds of hand signs, but has very limited voluntary control over its vocalizations. Second, the neural pathways that control hand movements and speech production overlaps significantly in the human brain, suggesting that the systems co-evolved. Third, modern humans still use gesture as a natural accompaniment to speech, and people who are born blind still gesture when they speak, even though they have never seen anyone gesture. This suggests that gesture and speech are deeply integrated in the human cognitive system, and that gestural communication likely preceded spoken language by a significant margin, perhaps by hundreds of thousands of years. When did spoken language emerge? the anatomical evidence provides our clearest clue. Speech production requires precise control of the larynx, tongue, and lips, a coordination that is physically impossible for non-human primates. The critical anatomical feature is the position of the larynx, or voice box, in human infants and in non-human primates. The larynx sits high in the throat, allowing them to breathe and swallow at the same time. But around 3 months of age, the human larynx begins to descend, creating a longer vocal tract, specifically a larger pharyngeal cavity, that allows for the production of a wider range of vowel sounds. This descent comes at a cost. It makes humans uniquely vulnerable to choking on food, a design trade-off that would only be worth the risk if the benefits of spoken language were enormous. By examining fossil skulls, scientists can estimate the position of the larynx in ancient humans by looking at the shape of the base of the skull. The basic cranium, a flatter basic cranium, indicates a descended larynx, and therefore the ability to produce modern speech. Sounds. Fossil evidence suggests a modern style. Descended larynx was present by at least 350,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier. Some researchers, including W. Tecumseh Fitch, argued in his 2010 book, The Evolution of Language, that the anatomical prerequisites for speech may have been present in the last common ancestor of humans and Neanderthals, suggesting that spoken language could be at least 500,000 years old. The genetic evidence adds another layer to the timeline. In 2001, a landmark study led by Dr. Wolfgang Innard at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig discovered a gene called FOXP2 that is directly linked to speech and language ability. Members of a British family with a mutation in a FOXP2 suffered from severe speech and language impairments, unable to coordinate the complex mouth movements required for fluent speech. FOX2 became known as the language gene, though it is involved in broader neural development. Innard compared the human version of FOXP2 to the version found in other primates and found that the human version differs by 2 specific amino acid changes that occurred sometime in the last 200,000 years, after the human lineage split from chimpanzees. This time frame matches the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. What made the finding even more significant was that Neanderthals, whose genome was sequenced in 2010, carried the same version of FOXP2 as modern humans. This means that the genetic changes that enabled complex speech were present in the common ancestor of humans and Neanderthals, pushing the potential origin of spoken language back to at least 600,000 years ago. The FOXP2 gene is not the whole story, but it provides a genetic timestamp for when the neural circuitry for speech became possible. Why did language evolve in the first place? What survival advantage was so powerful that it drove the restructuring of the human brain and throat? Robin Dunbar proposed in his 1996 book, Grooming, Gossip, and the Evolution of Language. Dunbar noted that primates maintain social bonds through grooming, spending hours each day picking parasites from each other's fur. This grooming time serves a critical function. It builds trust, establishes alliances, and maintains group cohesion. But as primate groups grew larger, the time required to groom everyone became unsustainable. A group of 50 individuals would need each member to spend over 30% of their waking hours grooming to maintain the necessary social bonds. Language, Dunbar argued, evolved as a more efficient substitute for grooming. It allowed individuals to bond with multiple group members simultaneously, share information about the social landscape, and maintain group cohesion with far less time investment. The evidence for this theory comes from the correlation between group size and language complexity across human societies, and from the content of modern conversation, which is dominated by social topics, gossip about others, and relationship management. Exactly what Dunbar theory predicts. Language, in this view, did not evolve primarily for sharing practical information about hunting or toolmaking. It evolved for talking about other people. An alternative theory focuses on the role of language in cooperative foraging and hunting. Stephen Mithen argued in his 2005 book, The Singing Neanderthals, that language evolved from a pre-existing musical and emotional communication system, which he calls holistic, manipulative, multimodal, musical, and mimetic. Mithen proposed that early human communication was holistic and emotional, more like song than speech, and that it served to coordinate group activities and share emotional states. Over time, This system became increasingly segmented and symbolic, eventually giving rise to language as we know it. This theory helps explain why music and language share so many cognitive and neural resources, and why emotional prosody, the melody of speech, is processed separately from grammatical content in the brain. The archaeological record of early human tool-making also supports a link between language and complex technical skills. The production of Acheulean hand axes, which appeared around 1.7 million years ago, requires the ability to plan a sequence of actions, hold a mental template of the finished tool, and teach the process to others. These cognitive demands overlap significantly with the demands of language, and some researchers argue that the two abilities co-evolved. Perhaps the most hotly debated question in language evolution is whether Neanderthals could speak. Early reconstructions of Neanderthal vocal anatomy suggested that their larynx was positioned higher than in modern humans, limiting their ability to produce certain vowel sounds. In 2018, a team led by Dr. Stephen W. at the University of New England in Australia used SCAT scanning and 3D modeling to reconstruct a Neanderthal hyoid bone, the small bone in the throat that anchors the muscles of the tongue and larynx. Their analysis found that the Neanderthal hyoid was functionally indistinguishable from that of modern humans, combined with the genetic evidence that Neanderthals carried the human version of the FOXP2 gene. The case for Neanderthal language has grown significantly stronger. Neanderthals also left behind archaeological evidence of symbolic behavior, including burial of their dead, with grave goods, the use of pigments for body decoration, and the production of personal ornaments from shells and feathers. These behaviors are difficult to explain without some form of complex symbolic communication. The picture that emerges is one in which multiple human species, including Neanderthals and possibly Denisovans, had the biological capacity for language, suggesting that language may have been present in the common ancestor of all these groups, potentially over 600,000 years ago. If language is so old, why does it look so different across cultures? The answer lies in the relationship between the biological capacity for language and the specific languages that cultures develop. All human children are born with the same biological capacity for language, the ability to acquire any human language they are exposed to, but the specific language they learn is shaped by thousands of years of cultural evolution. Languages change over time through a process of mutation and selection that mirrors biological evolution. Sounds shift, grammar changes, vocabulary is lost and gained over long enough timescales. Languages become mutually unintelligible. Linguists can trace these changes backward to reconstruct the ancestral languages from which modern languages descended. By comparing the shared vocabulary and grammatical structures of related languages, they can peer deeper into the past. The oldest language family that has been reliably reconstructed is Proto-Indo-European, spoken around 6,000 years ago. Beyond 10,000 years, accumulated changes erase detectable signals. Some linguists, including Merritt Rulin, have argued for an even deeper common ancestor, proto-human or proto-world, spoken before the human migration out of Africa. Most linguists consider this speculation. The question of when language emerged also depends on how you define language. If you define language as the modern human capacity for recursive syntax, the ability to embed one clause inside another to generate potentially infinite meaning, the timeline shifts dramatically. Noam Chomsky at MIT famously argued that this capacity appeared suddenly in human evolution, perhaps as recently as 50,000 years ago, as a result of a single genetic mutation that rewired the brain. In a 2002 paper published in Science, Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch proposed that the core computational mechanism of language, which they called the faculty of language in the narrow sense, is unique to humans and may have appeared relatively recently in evolutionary time. But it highlights an important point: the mental grammar that allows you to understand a sentence like the rat that the cat that the dog chased ate was gray, which embeds one clause inside another to a depth of 3 levels, requires processing capacity that is not found elsewhere in the animal kingdom, and the archaeological record suggests that this capacity may have been in place by at least 100,000 years ago. When we see the first evidence of fully symbolic behavior, including the use of pigments, personal ornaments, and complex burial practices, the archaeological evidence for when language became fully modern comes from the explosion of symbolic behavior that appears in the African archaeological record around 100,000 years ago. At Blombos Cave, In South Africa, archaeologists have found engraved ochre plaques with geometric patterns, shell beads that were clearly strung as necklaces, and bone tools that required complex manufacturing sequences. These artifacts are not just evidence of cognitive sophistication. They are evidence of symbolic communication. An engraved pattern on a piece of ochre means something to the person who made it, and it was intended to mean something to others. It is a symbol, and symbols are the building blocks of language. Similar evidence appears later in Europe, with the arrival of anatomically modern humans around 45,000 years ago, including cave paintings, carved figurines, and musical instruments. The capacity for symbolic thought and communication was clearly present by this time. It means that language, which had likely existed in some form for hundreds of thousands of years, had reached a level of sophistication that allowed for the external storage and transmission of symbolic information. This was the flowering of a capacity developing for millennia. Another crucial line of evidence comes from the study of language acquisition in children and the cognitive prerequisites for language. Michael Tomasello has spent decades studying how children acquire language and how this process compares to the communication systems of other primates. In his 2008 book Origins of Human Communication, Tomasello argues that the foundational cognitive ability that makes language possible is what he calls shared intentionality, the ability to understand that other people have intentions, knowledge, and beliefs that may differ from your own, and to coordinate your actions with theirs based on this understanding. Shared intentionality emerges in human children around 9 to 12 months of age, well before they begin speaking. It manifests in behaviors like pointing, showing objects to others, and following someone else. Gaze. Non-human primates do not point to share attention. They point to request. The difference is subtle but profound. Pointing to share attention requires understanding that the other person has a mind that you can influence with information. This understanding, Tomasello argues, is the foundation on which language is built. The implication is that the cognitive infrastructure for language, the ability to read and influence the mental states of others, evolved before language itself and created the conditions under which language could emerge. Let us bring the timeline together. The best current evidence suggests that language evolved through a series of stages spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Stage 1, perhaps as early as 1.8 million years ago with Homo erectus, saw the emergence of basic symbolic communication, likely gestural, supported by a growing capacity for shared intentionality and complex tool-making. Stage 2, between 1 million and 500,000 years ago, saw the gradual reshaping of the human vocal tract to support spoken language, driven by the selective advantages of vocal communication. The FOXP2 gene changes occurred during this period, shared with Neanderthals. Stage 3, between 500,000 and 100,000 years ago, saw the refinement of spoken language and the emergence of grammatical structure, though the extent of this structure is debated. Stage 4, after 100,000 years ago, with anatomically modern Homo sapiens, saw the full flowering of symbolic culture and the use of language for art, ritual, and complex social organization. It suggests that our ancestors have been speaking, in some form, for far longer than we typically imagine. They are the living descendants of a communication system that has been evolving for at least as long as our species has existed, and quite possibly longer. There is a deeper implication to this timeline that is worth considering. If language has been part of human biology for hundreds of thousands of years, then it has been shaping our evolution for just as long. Language did not just arise from a pre-existing human brain. It actively reshaped that brain. The need to learn and process language selected for larger, more efficient neural networks for memory, syntax, and social cognition. The children who could learn language more easily survived and reproduced more. Over generations, the human brain became increasingly specialized for language. This process, called gene culture, coevolution, means that language and the human brain evolved together, each shaping the other. The clearest evidence of this coevolution is the existence of dedicated language areas in the human brain, Broca area and Wernicke area, that are not present in the same form in other primates. These areas are not there because language was added to an existing brain. They are there because the brain evolved in the presence of language for so long that it developed specialized structures to handle it. We are not apes that learn to talk. We are the descendants of talking apes, shaped by language at every level of our biology. Well, quote, The next time you open your mouth and words come out, consider what that simple act represents. You are using a biological system that took at least 100,000 generations to evolve. You are producing sounds with a vocal tract that was reshaped by evolution at significant cost, making you uniquely vulnerable to choking, all for the benefit of being able to share what is inside your mind with another mind. You are using a brain that has been sculpted by language, with dedicated neural tissue for grammar and vocabulary that no other primate possesses. And you are participating in a system that connects you, through an unbroken chain of transmission, to the first humans who ever attempted to share a thought with sound. The words you are reading right now were produced by a technology that did not exist for most of human history. But the language behind them, the cognitive system that makes them meaningful, has been part of what makes us human for longer than any other technology, any other cultural practice, any other form of symbolic behavior that we have ever developed. Language is not something we invented. It is something we became. The first human to speak did not know they were making history. They just needed to share something with someone they trusted, and that is how it all began. You are still speaking.